Yes.
So still on the topic of product usage, some communications with and notes produced by Spaywood from 1978 provide some further illumination. If we start with IPSN 40388_013, IPSN 0000338_013. So we can see this is a letter written from Mr. Williams of Spaywood to Dr. Delamore, September 1978. They've obviously had a meeting. He says, I enjoyed our meeting, look forward to keeping in touch with you. I'll send you a sample of our new product. With a batch of a new batch of the current Spaywood animal product going through at the moment. I'll send details plus a sample for testing. He refers to case notes on a French case. Not quite clear what that's concerned with. And then he says he'll be seeing Dr. Wensley to talk about COAT in the hope that we can be restored to your list of suppliers. So it would appear that they had previously, Manchester had previously purchased COAT and then had ceased to do so, and this was an attempt to persuade Dr. Delamore, Dr. Wensley to start using COAT again. The record of the meetings themselves provide some information, further information. So if we start with IPSN 40338_014, this is Mr. Williams' note of his meeting with Dr. Delamore on the 6th of September 1978. It says, Dr. Wensley does all the factor 8 buying, so this was very much a courtesy call. The centre has used armour material for the past year and is reluctant to change. They've just been notified of a price increase, but even so, Delamore indicated that a change was unlikely. I think if the incentive is made large enough, the situation could be changed. I'll be meeting with Wensley. Delamore stated cash for factor 8 commercial purchase is tightly controlled. Commercial concentrates are only used for home treatment. So if that's a correct record, at this point in time, 1978, the home treatment programme was one that used commercial concentrates only. And then there's a discussion about animal product down towards the bottom of the page. There's a discussion about von Willebrand's. Dr. Delamore felt a von Willebrand factor would be of considerable theoretical interest. Cryo is used successfully at present without problems. So would appear unsurprisingly, cryoprecipitate appears to be the treatment of choice for von Willebrand's patients at that time. And then if we go to IPSN 40338_011, we have the note of Mr. Williams' meeting later that year with Dr. Wensley on the 22nd of November 1978. Wensley is very interested in porcine, although his last clinical usage was a frightening experience. He believes fibre to be safer and possibly more effective than our current product. And then human, our work on PE human was of great interest. In his view, a hepatitis-free product would be of enormous value. He buys commercial concentrate purely on price and thinks the quality differences between manufacturers are insignificant. He stated that Lister material now compares well with commercial and is gradually changing his home treatment patients to this from cryobuline and Hemophilia. Commercial will then be used only in operations. So pausing there, it would appear there's an intention on the part of Dr. Wensley to shift the home treatment programme from a commercial-based programme to an NHS-based programme. He will ask us to quote next time round, but currently has big stocks of armour. A regional contract at the start we're now discussing is of no interest since he already buys for all the centres in his region. He's recently been ordering in 250,000 unit lots and paying up front, calling off as required. And then over the page, there's a discussion about protein fractions containing immunoglobulins. If we then look at NHBT 0089538, this is a letter dated the 28th of October 1981. It's from Dr. Wensley to Dr. Smith at BPL. And if we look at the text of the letter, we could see from the second paragraph, he says, in this region, almost all Elstree factor VIII concentrate is used for home treatment of haemophiliacs. So it would appear that by 1981, that which had been alluded to in the Spaywood visit, the attention of changing from commercial to Elstree product for home treatment, had been implemented, if what's said in this letter is correct, at least at that point in time. If we then look at TREL 40248_104, we can see here it's a letter from Dr. Evans, the Manchester Children's Hospital, to Dr. Arenstan at Trelaws, and it's really the first paragraph which tells us a little about what's being done in the Royal Infirmary. Dr. Wensley tells me that they've used 500 units of several brands of commercial concentrate intravenously daily to desensitize their patients. And then there's the suggestion in the next paragraph that that may not be ethical in relation to paediatric patients. Now, it would appear likely from what's said in the first paragraph and from other materials that we're talking there about patients with inhibitors. That's the reference to desensitization. It's not clear from that whether what's being recorded as Dr. Wensley's practice is using several brands of commercial concentrate for an individual patient so that a patient receives several different brands, or whether across the cohort of patients to whom this practice applies, various different brands are used. But again, we certainly don't seem to see here anything of the only use one commercial product or batch dedication that we've seen from some other centre directors. We then, in terms of documentation about product usage, come to the 1983 annual return to UK Hcdo. If we start with Hcdo 0000170_010, I'll explain why some figures appear to be crossed out in a moment. We can see this is the annual return for 1983 for Manchester Royal Infirmary. Director Dr. Delamore. Total number of haemophilia A patients treated during the year 140. Carriers of haemophilia A 7. Von Willebrand's disease patients 24. And then we can see the figures for cryoprecipitate. 470,600 used at hospital for haemophilia A patients. No record there of any being used for home treatment. 13,860 for carriers. And then in relation to von Willebrand's patients, cryoprecipitate is there recorded as used both in hospital and for home treatment. The figures given 74,760 and 27,300 respectively. If we skip over the crossed out figures for a moment and we see the next figure that's not crossed out is the reference to cryobuline, the immunofactor VIII, and we can see a small amount there being used for both hospital and home treatment. The reason why figures have been crossed out is, I anticipate, explained by a letter at Hcdo 40170_004. This is a letter to Miss Spooner at Oxford from A.M. Byrne, the chief MLSO at the Royal Infirmary. And he's recording here alterations to the haemophilia returns for 1983. And so the inference may be that these are the correct and up-to-date figures. And that may be why we've seen the crossed-out figures on the other document. So we have NHS concentrate, hospital usage 283,844, home treatment usage 1,021,945. And then we see alpha prophylate, hospital usage 492,808, home treatment 127,249, Highland Hemophil 707,867 hospital, 560,786 home treatment, porcine factor 8 52,910, factor 9 25,100, and autoplex. And then factor 9, this is then for the treatment of haemophilia B, 540,185. So we can see here substantial quantities of NHS product, but also still substantial quantities of commercial products being used. And the home treatment programme is neither exclusively commercial nor exclusively Elstree by now. In 1983, we can see that those receiving home treatment that there's a mix of products being used for home treatment. There's then one further document from November 1984 which provides some insight into Dr. Wensley's approach to the treatment of patients with inhibitors. It is at IPSN 5036_012. So this is current approaches to the treatment of inhibitor patients in the UK. The third paragraph on that first page says the intention of this report is to summarise the national trends in the treatment of haemophiliacs with inhibitors, and then to address more specifically the current views and approaches of the directors of the major haemophilia centres to the treatment of their patients, with particular emphasis on their attitudes towards Hcdo, stated the 2nd of November 1984. We've looked at this document for what it says about individual directors on a number of occasions, and I'm going to show you in a moment what it says about Manchester. But it may be instructive at some point to consider it as a whole, because what it shows is an absence of a consistent approach, at least across the major haemophilia centres, to the treatment of inhibitors, and a very varied approach regionally. If we go to the third page, we can see the position in relation to Manchester. We go down to the bottom half. Thank you. So MRI have 16 inhibitor patients, of whom 14 are normally treated with either human factor 8 or human factor 8 and plasma exchange. And then further details given about the use of plasma exchange. In other circumstances, an immune tolerance regimen is favoured, whereby on presentation with a bleed, the patient is given a minimum of 20,000 units of factor 8 over the first 5 days, and then 250 units given every other day until the inhibitor is suppressed. Manchester claimed to have reduced the inhibitor titer in 13 out of 14 of the patients using this regimen. And then there's a reference to two patients treated in an autoplex trial, and Hcdo having been sent to Manchester for antibody assays. And then if we look at the comments, MRI has a fairly idiosyncratic approach to the treatment of inhibitors. They consider the use of activated or non-activated factor 9 almost, go over the page, unethical in view of its low degree of efficacy. They've no fundamental objections to using porcine factor 8, but don't feel that they are likely to have the need to use it very often. They are, however, very interested in using it in virgin non-inhibitor patients, but see cost as being the main drawback in this area. Pausing there, so two points to note about this document. The first is the point just made in the report, that Manchester expressed an interest in using porcine factor 8 for virgin non-inhibitor patients. If we go back to the previous page, and look at the second half of the page again, one can see what appears to be set out here in 1984. Indeed, this is a report dated at the end of 1984. So at a point in time at which the risk of AIDS may be thought to have been fairly well known to centre directors, a strategy which could perhaps be characterised as somewhat a high-risk strategy of giving inhibitor patients large amounts of factor VIII is here recorded. That brings us then to early 1985 and the introduction of heat-treated products. Again, we may need to look at a handful of documents to try and get a sense of the timing of the introduction of heat-treated products. So if we start with BAYP 5024_070, we can see this is a Cutter report, 5th of February 1985, so it's an internal memo. It said the activity seen in December 84 with regard to AIDS and factor VIII concentrators slowed down during January. All centres in this region have converted from non-heat-treated commercial material to heat-treated commercial factor VIII concentrate. Opinion seems to be divided, however, on the use of non-heat-treated NHS material. The following centres are continuing to use non-heat-treated NHS material. And you'll see a number of centres there set out, but in the Northwest region, for present purposes, Manchester, and then Liverpool, Lancaster, and Blackburn. As at February 1985, this would suggest that non-heat-treated Elstree products still being used in Manchester. If we go over the page, you'll just see bottom half of the page, some insight into Dr. Wensley's thinking at this time. So in the heading, Development in Major Target Accounts, the Manchester connection, hopes of obtaining the Manchester contract during 1985 were dashed after learning that Dr. Wensley had managed to raise finance for his research. Dr. Wensley has simply switched from propylate to propylate heat-treated. Dr. Wensley appears to believe in the wet heat treatment process. He's reserving judgment until results of liver function studies on patients using alpha-HT are known. Nevertheless, from further communications, he's told me that all being equal, i.e. price and HTLV3, non-A, non-B reduced risk, he will award the contract to Cutter. Tenders regarding this contract should be expected in late February or early March 85. Dr. Wensley has asked me if he could visit Cutter USA plants while in the States for the San Diego meeting in July. This request was passed on to Mr. Pete D. Hart, who welcomed the idea and offered every help. So that's what we see being said there about Manchester. If we then go to NHBT 009457, what we've got here are a number of letters regarding the introduction of heat-treated products in the Manchester area. Shimit, could we go first of all, because these are out of chronological order, to page 4. We can see here a letter from the Hemophilia Society. It's from the chair of the Northwest group of the Hemophilia Society to the chair of the Northwest Regional Health Authority. Dear Sir John, I write to you on a matter which is causing grave concern to all haemophiliacs and their families in the Northwest area. As you are no doubt aware, supplies of heat-treated concentrates have not yet been introduced for treatment of patients at Manchester Royal Infirmary. So as at 10th of January, that's said to be the position as a matter of fact. To be informed by the hospital that this product, which is believed to be AIDS-free, will be made available sometime in 1985 is quite frankly not good enough. Given the fact that haemophiliacs are putting their lives at risk either by refusing essential treatment for bleeding episodes or by the use of possibly contaminated concentrates, I would be obliged if you would reply to the following points. 1, is this matter being given the urgent consideration and priority necessary to safeguard the lives of haemophiliacs in the Northwest? 2, Why is Manchester Royal Infirmary the only supra-regional centre in the UK not using heat-treated concentrates? And then 3, there's a reference to a meeting between the Haemophilia Society and Lord Glenarthur about funding. And over the page, just for the sake of completeness, it said applications were made prior to Christmas for monies to be made immediately available for the purchase of heat-treated concentrates. Why has a decision not yet been reached, and how long is the hospital to wait before they can expect an answer? If we then go, Seamus, to the 3rd page, there's a letter of the same date, 10th of March 1985, from Mr. Waters of the Haemophilia Society to Dr. Gunson, saying, we're more than a little alarmed to learn that alone of all the super-regional haemophilia centres, Manchester is without heat-treated factor 8 or 9 for the treatment of patients with haemophilia. We take a most serious view of this. Would be grateful if you could advise us of the reasons for the non-availability of such products in Manchester. And he says he's written in the same terms to the Health Authority and copied it to Dr. Wensley and Dr. Delamore. Now, if we then go to page 2 of this, we have Dr. Gunson's response to Mr. Waters. And he says this: I can inform you that the decision to use heat-treated factor 8 concentrate from commercial sources had been taken prior to my receipt of your letter. I can assure you that this matter was given careful consideration and that the serious nature of the problems which face patients suffering from haemophilia was not underestimated during discussions which have taken place between the Chairman and Chief Officers of the Regional Health Authority and myself. Allocation of the necessary finances allowed the withdrawal of all untreated commercial factor 8 and its replacement with heat-treated material, and this process has now commenced. As you are aware, heat-treated factor 8 concentrate from NHS plasma will not be available in any quantities until April 1985, and my colleague Dr. Wensley and I are urgently considering means by which the use of untreated NHS factor 8 can be restricted without placing any patients at risk. And then he goes on to talk about the aspirations for heat treatment, discouraging high-risk donors, and longer-term hopes for a screening test. So it would appear from Dr. Gunson's response that as at the 15th of January 1985, the decision has been taken that heat-treated products will be used. The finance has been allocated. What's less clear is whether, as at this date, which is a month on, over a month on from the Reference Centre Directors meeting of the 10th of December 1984, whether the actual process is substantially underway or not, or whether in the intervening weeks patients have continued to be using unheated products for their home or hospital treatment. An inference may well be, perhaps the most likely inference, that patients have continued in the intervening weeks to be using unheated products. If we can, on the same issue, go to a document that I'm very grateful for having been provided to the inquiry by core participants. It's COLL 603. And these are the minutes of a special haemophilia meeting on AIDS held at the Manchester Royal Infirmary on Sunday, the 3rd of February. And it's 1985. It's not dated, but it's clear from the context of the letter. We can see that the meeting's chaired by Dr. Delamore. Speakers are Mrs. Guy, chair of the Northwest branch of the Haemophilia Society, and Professor Longson, Professor of Virology, University of Manchester. And then there's a panel present, Dr. Evans from the Children's Hospital, Professor Longson, the virologist, Dr. Wensley, and Dr. Williamson, an immunologist consultant at the Preston Royal Infirmary. And so what one can see from this is a, as it were, a meeting to which patients were invited to attend. And we can see the context of it from the first paragraph. The meeting was declared open by the chair, Dr. Delamore, who then introduced Mrs. Guy as first speaker. She said she'd received many telephone calls from haemophiliacs needing reassurance, and so she'd asked the haemophilia department at MRI to arrange a meeting as soon as possible. So it would appear that the trigger for the meeting is a request from the Haemophilia Society representative rather than from the Haemophilia Centre. She made reference to the last Haemophilia Reference Centre Directors meeting, where it had been decided to use heat-treated factor 8 on all Haemophilia A patients as soon as possible. That must be the 10th of December Elstree meeting. She said how pleased she was at the number of patients who'd attended the meeting. There's then a lecture on viruses and antibodies to viruses from Professor Longson. And then Dr. Delamore is recorded as thanking Professor Longson and then introducing the panel, who directly answered questions from the audience as follows. I won't go through all of them, sir. You'll no doubt want to read the document in full, but just a couple of them. The first of which is relevant to the issue we were just exploring. Question, will all the Haemophilia A patients go on to heat-treated factor 8? Dr. Wensley's answer, as home treatment patients come in for more factor 8 supplies, they will be changed onto heat-treated clotting factor or be given more of the same batch that they have been using. They will not, however, be treated by a new non-heat-treated batch of factor 8. Again, so that answer would appear to suggest that, and we're now at the 3rd of February, that there has been no immediate request for the attempt at recall of the unheated product that patients had, and that products are going to be replaced as and when patients' supplies for home treatment run out and they come in. And then they'll be given, even then, not necessarily heat-treated clotting factor. They may be given heat-treated clotting factor or more of the same batch, and that's presumably dependent upon supplies. If we just then go over the page, we can see there's a question as to whether heat-treated factor 9 is available, and Dr. Wensley says not available from the NHS at the moment, but being explored. Hoped it'll become available by the summer of 1985. And then there are various discussions about heat treatment, about the symptoms of AIDS, about risks to family members. If we go to the 3rd page, and we zoom in on the top half of the page, we look at the 3rd set of questions and answers. Question, should we assume that we've got the HTLV3 virus and inform the dentist? Answer, all patients will shortly be tested for the HTLV3 antibody, but until the results of those tests are available, it is best to assume that you might, I think the word B is omitted, positive, and to inform your dentist. So I'll come on in due course to the question of testing, but it would appear that as at the 3rd of February, certainly not all patients have been tested, and an inference from this answer may be that the process of testing had not yet commenced. In terms of the introduction of heat-treated products, I'm not going to go to the following set of documents I described, but I'll just let you know what they are, sir. Dr. Gunson addresses the issue in his HIV litigation statement, but again, as I say, that's, as it were, several years later after the event. And there is correspondence or memos in 1988, I think in the context of responding to potential legal claims, where Dr. Lee and others provide a basic chronology of decision-making in relation to heat-treated product. But that's all about the process of getting approval for funding rather than the actual practical mechanics of when heat-treated products and how heat-treated products were introduced. There is, however, one later document that it may be worth looking at. Shemek, it's NHBT 00965999_012. Handwriting is correct. Yes. So this is a later document. It's a memo from Dr. Wensley to Dr. Lee, dated the 18th of December 1988. But it provides details of what supplies were received in the first half of 1985. No heat-treated factor 8 was received before January 1985. The deliveries of heat-treated factor 8 to NBTS Manchester are as shown below. And so just looking to start with in the right-hand column, commercial, we can see that all the new product received by way of commercial product in the first 6 months of 1985 was heat-treated. Looks like it was all propylate from that. In terms of NHS product, we can see that in both January and March of 1985, non-heat-treated supplies were received. 135,000 units of non-heat-treated NHT in January, 27,000 units of non-heat-treated material in March of 1985. And presumably, given what we know about shortages, those are products that were used for the treatment of patients.
Do we have any information about whether this heat-treated product was 8Y, which seems unlikely in February 85, or was the retro heat-treated product which the NHS were producing as an interim?
I don't think we have any information specific to Manchester, but it would seem from other material that we've seen unlikely to be 8Y, which I don't think was anticipated to be available until April of 1985.
Well, there was some, I think there's some uncertainty, I think, we may see in later evidence about when the first batch was produced. There certainly wasn't on general distribution, but there was some produced, I think, in December of 84. If one takes one view anyway, as expressed in the records. So it's possible, but it seems unlikely.
It seems unlikely, and obviously some, at least as we can see from this, was not heat treated at all.
Yes.
And if we go to BAYP 5024_149. We can see this is a memo dated, an internal cutter memo dated the 29th of March 1985, and I think we've looked at this already, but if we look at it's a slightly later one from the one that we previously looked at. If we look at the bottom of the first page, we can see the reference to Manchester. The signs are indicating that the Manchester area will possibly start using factor 9 heat-treated commercial material in April/May. So those with haemophilia B would still have been, I think, on any view, being treated, if they were being treated with non-heat-treated material at this point in time. And then regular NHS factor 8 is being used. And the reference to regular appears to be a reference to non-heat-treated factor 8. And then, not of direct relevance to the question of the introduction of heat-treated product, but possibly of some interest, BAYP 5024_230. This is a later cutter memo, 20th of May 1985, just the first paragraph. It refers to a propylate HT trial and results presented by Dr. Savage. Results provide evidence to support Alpha's claim that propylate HT is free from non-A, non-B hepatitis. Dr. Savage's results also support those of Dr. Kernoff and Dr. Wensley. Both have previously claimed the safety of propylate HT in terms of non-A, non-B hepatitis. So drawing attention to that simply from what it tells us about Dr. Wensley and his approach to non-A, non-B hepatitis in 1985. We do have the 1986 annual return to UK Hcdo. I think there's no reason for thinking that the products used at that time were anything other than heat-treated. I won't go to it. but I'll just give you the reference there. It's Hcdo 40347_011. And what it shows that in the course of 1986, 85% or thereabouts of factor VIII used by MRI was commercial, mostly coatant haemophil, and cryoprecipitate by 1986 was a very minor part of the materials that were being used for haemophilia A patients. And then just finally on the question of porcine factor VIII, if we go to IPSN 5057_066, what we've got here, and it's, if we have the first half of the page, thank you, is an abstract of a paper apparently delivered at the World Federation of Haemophilia meeting in 1986 by Byrne, Cottrell, Morn, Wensley, Denimore, Manchester Royal Infirmary, on the use of porcine factor VIII to treat haemophilia A patients without inhibitors. And it records that high-purity porcine factor VIII, high HC, was used to cover essential surgery in 4 patients who'd received little or no previous blood products, with the intention of avoiding any exposure to the AIDS-related virus and the hepatitis viruses. The patients had no inhibitors to human or porcine factor VIII-C. Good levels of factor VIII-C activity were maintained during and for about 7 days following surgery, when progressive resistance was noted in all patients, and then there's further details there provided. We conclude that porcine factor VIII-C is a useful alternative to human factor VIII-C concentrate in mild haemophilia A patients who are requiring essential surgery. A further insight into at least some aspect of Manchester's treatment policies in response to the risks of infection. So I'm going to move, sorry, in fact, before I move to the next topic, just trying, we can take that down, thank you. Just with some general observations about product usage and treatment policy. We can see from the documents that I've shown, broadly speaking, as a matter of fact, what products were being used at the Manchester Royal Infirmary to treat the patients with bleeding disorders in the late 70s and the first half of the 80s. We can see very substantial quantities of factor VIII concentrate being used. We see the usage of cryoprecipitate. What we don't get a sense of, unfortunately, from the documents is what the particular approach was, other than in relation to the document we've just looked at, to treating different categories of patients. It may be fair to infer that patients with severe haemophilia A on home treatment were clearly being treated by 1983 with exclusively factor VIII concentrates, both commercial and NHS concentrates. I think it's fairly probably also easy to infer that a reason for the substantial uses of commercial concentrates was the absence of sufficient quantities of NHS concentrates. What the particular policies, if any, were towards the treatment of patients with mild or moderate haemophilia or previously untreated or minimally treated patients isn't something that one can pull together from the material that we've seen. So it is, unfortunately, at best, an incomplete picture in that respect. Moving then to the question of knowledge of hepatitis, we can see through the very fact that Manchester was one of the major reference centres, and therefore its directors from the very beginning attended reference centre director meetings, that the clinicians in Manchester were aware of work being undertaken in relation to hepatitis and blood products from an early stage. And simply by way of example of that, we look at OXUH 40831_001. This is a meeting from October of 1968, of the MRC Cryoprecipitate Working Party, and a member of the working party was Dr. Israels, the then director at Manchester, and we can see from the bottom of the page that one of the issues there being discussed was the survey of incidents of jaundice in haemophilia, and over the page there's more detailed discussion about how that survey would be undertaken. Without going through, we can take that down, thank you, without going through all the minutes that we've looked at on a number of occasions of both reference centre director meetings and haemophilia centre director meetings, we have seen from the minutes that Dr. Delamore and or Dr. Wensley were regular attenders at these meetings. One or other, sometimes both, was usually there, and thus they can be taken to be aware of the information about both hepatitis B and non-A, non-B hepatitis and chronic liver disease that was discussed and shared during those meetings. You'll recall yesterday, Sir, Dr. Bevan's evidence of being particularly impressed as a junior doctor as to what Dr. Krask had said at a meeting in November 1979. There are various earlier meetings in which reports from the Hepatitis Working Party are shared with reference centre directors, and particularly throughout the second half of the 1970s. We can see also, if we look at DHSC 302173_048. Whilst we're getting that, we'll be able to see from this document that as reference centre directors, Dr. Delamore and or Dr. Wensley, in due course, were privy to the reports and studies that were being undertaken. So this, by way of example, is a written report that was prepared for the Haemophilia Centre Directors meeting in April of 1971, attended by Dr. Delamore, and it's a study of haemophilia A and Christmas disease patients, and we can see, I won't go through the detail of it, but first page, reference to a study of the incidence of transfusion hepatitis and inhibitors, two most alarming complications of treatment. Halfway down the page, transfusion hepatitis is thought to be a virus infection transmitted to the recipient by the donor plasma. There's every reason to suppose that the virus is contained in the various protein fractions used to treat haemophilia and Christmas disease. And then the next paragraph, the danger of infection can be calculated and will be related to the number of donors used to make the material used for treatment or the number of donor exposures. If large pools of plasma are used to make therapeutic concentrates, the theoretical danger of infection will be increased. And then there's a rather more detailed discussion. If we go on to page 9, we can see bottom of the page, the clinical value of free and early treatment of haemophilic patients in the saving of life and prevention of crippling is now well established. This treatment is known to carry two main hazards. One, the transmission of infective hepatitis. Won't deal with antibodies. If we just go further down the page, please, Shomik. There's a suggestion of patients being very resistant to clinical hepatitis. Hepatitis transmission must be related to the number of donor exposures of the patients. This number will increase with the use of tried concentrates made from large pools of donors. And then it goes on to talk about the advantages of concentrate treatment. And the view expressed at the end of that first paragraph, we feel the increased risk of clinical illness is not so great as to overbalance the advantages of the use of concentrate.
Well, the sentence perhaps deserves highlighting, three lines down. The problem in recommending an increased manufacture of these lies in the possible increase in hepatitis and antibodies.
Yes.
So the link there appears to be, theoretically at any rate, between the size of the pool
precisely
and the risk of hepatitis.
Yes, exactly so. And actually, if we look at the very bottom of that same page, The incidence of jaundice in treated patients must increase with the number of donor exposures, and the number of donor exposures must increase using concentrates derived, next page, from large pools. However, the greater reliability, ease of administration and economy of manufacture are in favour of concentrated materials. And then there is an aspiration that a method will be found to remove Australia antigen from concentrated materials. So that's as early as 1971. If we then look...
Do you read in the last two sentences there a call, or at least a view, which may be the same, that something ought to be done about inactivating the virus?
In the last sentence, yes. Absolutely.
And this is in 1971. Okay. So this is at a stage when the NHS, or the Lister virus, Lister factor 8 is on stream, although it's generally not the product of use. Generally cryoprecipitate is.
Yes.
And it's before any commercial concentrate made from even larger pools is licensed.
Yes, that's a little later on.
Well, that comes in 73, I think,
yes.
But first used in 72. Yeah, thank you.
If we then look at OXUH 40s, 499_002, we can see a letter dated 9th of March 1977. This is from Dr. Delamere to Dr. Ritzer at Oxford. He's obviously been asked to return a list of suggested topics for study by working parties. And he says, I've ticked the three I personally feel are most worthy of study and have numbered them according to priority. And if we go over the next page, we can see that his number one priority for study by working parties of the Haemophilia Centre directors is the incidence of hepatitis and haemophilia. If we go back to a document that we looked at this morning, and look at earlier this morning, and look at part of it we didn't previously go to, it's PRSE 40421, please, Shomik. This is the 1978 seminar we looked at for information about how Manchester Reference Centre operated. But if we go to page 5, please. Left-hand side, the second paragraph. This is still part of Dr. Delamore's talk. Hepatitis is carried in blood products, and Dr. Delamore noted that a very high percentage of patients being treated for haemophilia and Christmas disease are proving, after all, to be infected by one type of hepatitis or another. So this is 1978, so non-A, non-B hepatitis known to be a distinct type of hepatitis from hepatitis B. A great deal more work in assessing the severity of hepatitis needs to be undertaken, possibly to develop an immunisation against hepatitis, or in developing ways of making blood products safer. Reference centre directors meet together 2 or 3 times a year to discuss these problems and reassess working parties. And then it goes on to talk about the development of antibodies. So again, one can see Dr. Delamore clearly aware of and maybe thought concerned about infection with hepatitis. And the phrase, a great deal more work in assessing the severity of hepatitis needs to be undertaken, might be said to reveal a view that it certainly could be serious. He's not dismissing it as something benign or harmless. I'm not so going to go to some of the papers that we've looked at on multiple occasions, Professor Preston's 1978 paper, Dr. Krask's 1979 Working Party reports. it can fairly be assumed that Dr. Wensley and Dr. Delamore, as reference centre directors regularly attending these meetings, would have been aware of publications and discussions such as that. If we go then to Hcdo 40410, this is the reference centre directors meeting from the 6th of September 1982. We've looked at it on multiple occasions for its reference, early reference to AIDS. But if we go to page 10, and this is in the context of a discussion about of the work of the Hepatitis Working Party, we can see there Dr. Wensley is recorded as saying it was important to point out that hepatitis B had not entirely disappeared. There have been 2 new cases of hepatitis B in Manchester during the current year. And then, still in 1982, if we go to CBLA 301616, we can see here under the heading Current Topics in Haemophilia, this is the programme for a scientific symposium to be held in Manchester on the 14th of September 1982, to be chaired by Professor Bloom. If we go to session 2, so if we go a little further down the page, Hepatitis and Haemophilia, to be chaired by Professor Longson, and then 3 talks, The Spectrum of Liver Disease in Haemophiliacs from Dr. Stevens, Non-A, Non-B hepatitis, Professor Zuckerman, and then a talk about the removal of viral contaminants from coagulation factor concentrates by Dr. Snape of BPL. We have a text of Dr. Stevens' paper. Well, we have a booklet of the whole symposium at DHSC 0002221 _003. So we can see there, Department of Clinical Haematology, University of Manchester, Current Topics in Haemophilia, Proceedings of the Symposium held in Manchester on September the 14th, 1982, edited by Dr. Wensley. If we go to the next page, we'll see this was sponsored by ARMA. We wish to thank ARMA Pharmaceuticals for making a generous financial contribution towards the cost of the symposium and this publication. If we go on 2 pages, this is just noteworthy for the foreword by Professor Bloom. He says these are exciting times in the haemophilia world. And then he refers to the Haemophilia Centre Directors of the UK meet annually to discuss relevant problems. And then he talks about the 1980 symposium. We looked at that with Professor Lowe, you'll recall, sir. And so Manchester was following similar lines. And in addition to reviewing current knowledge on coagulation, the Manchester Symposium concentrated on the hepatitis problem and the pathogenesis and treatment of inhibitors, both of which constitute major problem areas for the haemophiliac. These are timely presentations because hope has been engendered by the development of hepatitis-reduced concentrates and for the induction of immune tolerance to factor VIII, but these therapeutic modalities still need very careful assessment. And then if we go to the last paragraph, the organisers of the symposium were to be congratulated, etc., etc. Much remains to be learnt. The knowledge imparted in this symposium set us on a course that will at least alleviate, if not yet cure, the depressive component of our psychiatric syndrome. That's a reference to the first paragraph of this foreword, which talks about those who care for haemophiliacs experiencing both highs and lows, effectively. And then this, unfortunately, true to form, new hazards are appearing on the horizon, including the acquired immune deficiency syndrome. The impact of these will no doubt feature in our next symposium. So that's Professor Bloom's observations. If we then go to, try page 40, Seamus. 2 pages further on. Thank you. Oh no, I've gone 1 page too much. Sorry, 1 page back. My apologies. So this is the text of the paper delivered by Dr. Stevens, which eventually translates to the publication that we've seen referred to before in 1983, entitled Liver Disease in Haemophiliacs, an Overstated Problem. And you'll recall Professor Hay then talked about the response to that in his 1985 publication. But instructive to see here what Dr. Stevens was saying. As a result of relatively recent developments in plasma collection and fractionation, many haemophiliacs now receive potent, easily reconstituted, convenient blood products, which have resulted in an improved lifestyle for the severe haemophiliac. But at what price? Over the past decade, clinicians have become increasingly aware of clinical, subclinical and laboratory abnormalities in multi-transfused haemophiliacs suggestive of hepatocellular damage. And there is increasing evidence that such damage is the result of viral infection, particularly non-A, non-B hepatitis. And then he says the problems associated with liver dysfunction in the haemophiliac can be considered under the following headings: clinical stigmata of liver disease in haemophiliacs, abnormal liver function tests, liver histology, and therapeutic approach to liver dysfunction in haemophiliacs. If we go down the bottom of the page, there's a discussion under this heading about jaundice. Bottom of the page, non-A, non-B hepatitis is becoming increasingly implicated, although the majority of cases are non-icteric. If we go over the page, if we go just a bit further down, thank you. So picking it up in the paragraph, direct questioning will not infrequently reveal symptoms compatible with a viral hepatitis-like illness, but such symptoms are not usually volunteered by haemophiliacs. The suggestion that they may possibly have some degree of liver dysfunction usually comes as a surprise to the patient, so as it were a problem of underreporting. Although most clinicians have seen or have heard about isolated haemophiliacs with severe liver disease associated with other clinical features, such cases are very infrequent. And in general terms, the symptoms and signs of significant liver disease are found relatively infrequently in haemophiliacs. So not found, but he's saying they're relatively infrequently. I'm glad to say that the number of deaths due to liver disease so far reported in the UK remains very small. There's then a discussion about abnormal liver function tests. If we go over 2 pages, please, Shomik. We can see under the heading Liver Histology in Haemophiliacs, he refers to various haemophilia centres undertaking programmes of routine liver biopsy. The rationale for such an invasive procedure in patients who are in the main asymptomatic and have a hemostatic defect were primarily the differentiation of chronic persistent hepatitis from chronic active hepatitis and cirrhosis, which may benefit from specific treatment and which may also place a new prognosis on the life expectancy of the haemophiliac. The following table reviews some of the initial results. And if we go to the top of the next page, there's a review of various reports of liver biopsies. And you'll see the first 6 cases, number with chronic active hepatitis/cirrhosis 3, so 50%. The second, again an American study, 13 cases, 5 with chronic active hepatitis/cirrhosis, so 38%. Minucci, Milan, number of cases 11, number of chronic active hepatitis cirrhosis 6, so 55%. And then we have Professor Preston's Sheffield work, and then a reference to work by Professor Schimpf in Heidelberg, 32 cases, 10 with chronic active hepatitis/cirrhosis, 31%. Goes on to say, it can be seen that early reports suggested that up to 50% of multi-transfused haemophiliacs have significant histological liver disease, either with chronic active hepatitis or cirrhosis, although histological interpretation may account for some variation in these exact figures. He then refers to the Heidelberg survey reporting the results of repeated liver biopsies and saying in those cases there proved to be no significant deterioration. We in Manchester have recently successfully carried out liver biopsies on 12 haemophiliacs, all of whom were multi-transfused and had persistently abnormal transaminase levels. And then you'll see there, of those 12, 1 had chronic active hepatitis and cirrhosis, and 4 showing signs of very mild chronic active hepatitis, and then others with one with chronic lobular, one with chronic persistent hepatitis. In our survey, he says only 1 patient had chronic active hepatitis and cirrhosis, although 4 other cases were considered to have very mild chronic active hepatitis. If we then go over to the next page, we can see, if we just zoom in on the top half of the page, he says, on the basis of this Manchester trial and the results of this recent worldwide collaborative study, I would like to suggest the following conclusions. The first is that long-term use of small donor pool products may carry as much risk of transmitting non-A, non-B hepatitis as that of large donor pool concentrates. So I'll leave that to one side because we're really concerned here about the seriousness of non-A, non-B. And then 2, the frequency with which therapeutically useful information is obtained from liver histology in haemophiliacs is limited and may not justify the risk of this procedure. So a significant part of Dr. Stevens' message is we don't get enough useful information to justify biopsies in haemophiliacs. He then goes on under the heading therapeutic to approach the liver disease in haemophiliacs to say this: at this time, we do not know how much of a problem liver disease represents itself in haemophilia. We do know that despite the exclusion of hepatitis B to a large degree, the dangers of viral disease transmission, presumably non-A, non-B, associated with intensive transfusion are far from over, and that even small donor pool cryoprecipitate may not be exempt from this problem. Although as yet mortality and the advances clinical sequelae of liver disease in haemophiliacs are thankfully rare, the potential risks remain, and all multi-transfused haemophiliacs must be followed closely for any clinical or laboratory evidence of hepatic deterioration. Then he goes on to suggest that it's debatable as to whether that should include liver biopsy. Next page. Last paragraph. The prospect of a new clean replacement products, either of human origin or from genetic engineering, leave hope for the future. But at the present time, it appears that the clinical risks associated with replacement therapy may be overstated and are certainly outweighed by the need to treat the haemophiliac by the rapid replacement of his deficient clotting factor. Also, one question that you may wish to consider in due course is whether that suggestion that the clinical risks may be overstated, and that leads then to the title of the published article, of which I think Dr. Wensley was a co-author, is actually consistent with the text of what's set out in the body of the paper and the findings from other biopsy studies.
Well, taken out of context at any rate, it's difficult to understand how that fits with something in the region of 50% of people who've been treated for 10 years in an infection which the assumption of the paper is it is associated with the replacement therapy, can be described as overstated, unless one knows what particular statements he's referring to.
Quite.
But if it's possibly a slow process, and possibly 10 years since, one of the interesting things that go through my mind as you were speaking is the earlier report showing that there hadn't been, that the cohorts of those treated by cryoprecipitate in 1971, presumably for a few years, because cryoprecipitate wouldn't have been available until 65, 66, showed no particular evidence of an incidence of hepatitis over and above that of the usual population. Here it's assumed that there certainly is an association, and so we start off with the basis that having concentrate can cause and does cause a hepatitis, and the hepatitis in 50% of the cases where there's been a biopsy, query why the cases are selected for study, are chronic active hepatitis as it is understood at the time.
Yes.
And in a few cases, cirrhosis. Yes, it's taken out of context. This is not an easy paragraph to understand.
It's not, and of course it then translates into the publication, which we see at PRSE 302564. And we just zoom in on the top half of the page. Liver disease and haemophiliacs an overstated problem? Question mark. Co-authored by Dr. Stevens, who was Manchester Children's Hospital, but then we'll see a number of other names there, including Dr. Wensley and Dr. Delamore of the Haemophilia Centre at the Royal Infirmary. And we've looked at the text of this previously. It's broadly consistent with the underlying paper that we've just looked at that was presented at the symposium.
Yes.
So just going to move on to the question of knowledge of HIV. Note the time. Do we pick that up at 2?
Yes, let's do that.